Should I start? Hello to everyone in the US, India, and other parts of the world joining us at odd hours. I'm your host, Ridhi Aggarwal, and it is my absolute honor to be interviewing Professor Lee Badgett for the third session in this year's Feminist Economics 101 series. Today, we will be discussing some crucial aspects of her research on sexual orientation and gender identity in the labor market. A brief introduction of your host today. As I said, my name is Ridhi Aggarwal. I'm from India, and I'm a master's student at Harvard Kennedy School, studying public administration with a focus on international development. You see, I focused it by pursuing an international development course. Anyway, I remember my first introduction to feminist economics as a field of study was through watching interviews online of scholars like Abena Odoro and Elissa Bronstein. And it is an absolute wonder that 2 years later, I'm hosting one myself. Before I introduce our esteemed speaker, I'd like to thank the Online Events Committee and the Young Scholar Committee for hosting this series. The series has been envisioned as a continuation of the Feminist Economics series featured in 2021 pre-conference. Some information about IAFE as well as some logistics for today. IAFE has greatly expanded its membership of young scholars in recent years. We hope this new season will create an important avenue to explore core concepts, issues, frameworks in feminist economics and the methodological differences between mainstream economics to conversations with experts in the field. Each event will feature interviews of senior scholars by young or early career scholars by providing an interactive dialogue between them. We also hope that these conversations will inform and empower young scholars in their work. If you're interested in any of our previous interviews, please do check out the IAFE website and our YouTube channel. I strongly recommend staying tuned to IAFE's social media and website for additional events, not only Feminist Economics 101, but also Feminist Economics of Global Reproductive Justice event series and several fireside chats. So, logistics for today. The event will typically last for an hour, be recorded and posted on YouTube. For the next 30 minutes, I will pose questions to Professor Badgett on sexual orientation and gender identity and how it relates to feminist economics, followed by a conversation on feminist economics in general. Then we aim to provide an interactive dialogue with Professor Badgett by including a Q&A session after the interview. Feel free to put your questions in the chat, or when we open for questions, you can use the raise hand function. Lastly, as this is a Zoom call and not a webinar, a friendly reminder to keep yourselves muted throughout the event. This was a long logistics. I'm going to get to the introduction now. Professor Badgett is a professor of economics and co-director of the Center for Employment Equity at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and she's the former director of the School of Public Policy. She's also a Williams Distinguished Scholar at UCLA's Williams Institute, where she was a co-founder and the first research director. She has a PhD in economics from UC Berkeley and a BA from the University of Chicago. Her research focuses on economic inequality of LGBTQ+ people, including wage gaps, employment discrimination, and poverty, and on the global cost of homophobia and transphobia. Her books on LGBTQ+ economic issues have debunked the myth of gay affluence and have shown that same-sex marriage is ultimately good for society. Anyone who has not read her book, The Economic Case for LGBT Equality, Why Fair and Equal Treatment Benefits Us All, I strongly recommend that you do, as I am currently doing. So without further ado, starting with the questions I have for Professor Lee Badgett. You are a well-known and a pioneering researcher to use the economics lens for building a space for LGBTQ+ rights in the labor markets globally. Could you explain your cutting-edge research in a couple of minutes? What are your research of interest and what questions are you asking to understand sexual orientation and gender identity in the labor market?
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this series. It's very exciting. And thanks to the Young Scholars Committee and online events committees for putting this together. This is really, I don't know, it just feels like a really exciting moment for IAFE when we've got so much engagement. So my own research has focused on trying to understand whether any economic inequality exists for LGBTI people. That seems like kind of an obvious question, but actually it's not so obvious. There are many stereotypes, I think, based in the visibility of some LGBTI people in different kinds of contexts. You know, one of the most highly paid people in the world is Anderson Cooper, the television commentator, and he's an openly gay man. So it's something that confuses people to see. So it's important, I think, to have data that really shows what the real picture is overall for LGBTI people. So I have started out looking at wage gaps and looking at that as evidence of how people are treated in the labor market. And over time I've expanded into thinking about other economic measures like poverty rates. In both those cases, most of the work that I've done has been in the US. What we see are wage gaps for gay men, in particular, compared to heterosexual men. For lesbian and bisexual women, there's interesting patterns of wage gaps that show that actually lesbian and bisexual women do better than heterosexual women, but heterosexual women at the bottom of the wage hierarchy. So all kinds of women, regardless of sexual orientation, earn less than men do overall. Transgender people actually also tend to do worse economically than LGBTI people, and we see that really clearly in the poverty data, where transgender people and bisexual women actually are really much more likely to be poor in the US. So I've worked on those issues. I worked for a long time on the marriage equality issue, which I'm happy to talk more about. Understanding why marriage was an important institution for families potentially, and how there was economic inequality embedded in lack of access to marriage. And so there's, kind of like the piece of understanding and identifying inequalities. And then there's the bigger question, which I think is really important, which is what do you do about them? A lot, my research on race and gender inequality when I was in graduate school was really about public policies. So I've done a lot on thinking about non-discrimination policies. And I will say, most recently, I have been working on and thinking about how we can be more directly focused on reducing economic inequalities through the kinds of programs that we've talked a lot about in IAFE around gender and development, and learning from those kinds of interventions to see if some of the same kinds of strategies might be useful for LGBTI people. That's my latest project, and that really comes out of an increasing international focus that I've started to get into, and thinking about how LGBTI inclusion, rights, opportunities, equal outcomes, how those might be really important for economies overall. And so the book that you mentioned, thank you for the plug, which is The Economic Case for LGBT Equality, that really makes that case. It says, we all lose out when LGBTI people are facing different kinds of inequality. So that's kind of the arc, I would say, of most of the work that I've been doing.
That sounds extremely interesting. I never thought about the hierarchy of wage gaps within these different spaces in the spectrum. That you mentioned about marriage equality. Do you want to explain a little bit about your research about that a little bit?
Yeah. So actually, I always had a lot of fun talking about marriage at IAFE conferences, because not everybody is a big fan of the institution of marriage. It certainly comes with a lot of patriarchal baggage. But I think but I think it's interesting because over time, at least the legal institution, if not its social meaning, the legal institution in many countries has become much more equal for men and women who entered into it. And frankly, I think that if that had not happened, that I don't think same-sex couples would have been that interested in marriage and marriage equality. But it does provide some very practical, useful aspects of it for people who are, buying property together, having children together, want to have a planned and joint financial future together in at least some ways, and that's how we think about that as economists, right? But actually, sociologists or anthropologists, they talk about the importance of marriage also as a way of creating new families, and the kinds of value, some of the value of marriage, I think, to people is really that symbolic, has that symbolic aspect of showing that you're people who will be living their lives together, demonstrating that to the people who are important to you, as in addition to the state, but to maybe your families of origin, maybe your friends, your neighbors, your communities, and that clearly has some very important meaning for LGBT people. It's a symbol of equality and inclusion, in a sense, at a national level as well. So I did a lot of work on thinking about what those economic aspects, the practical side was, but it became really clear to me when I did interviews of couples in the Netherlands, which was the first country to allow same-sex couples to marry. And I would walk in and, tell them about being an economist, and they would be like, we didn't get anything economically for marriage in the Netherlands. They didn't need that. But it did make a big difference to them and those other kinds of aspects of life, even for really out there feminists who said, I never thought I would want to get married, but here I had the opportunity to do it. And maybe, people have worked very hard for it, and that might be something that I should take advantage of, or recognizing that it did make them feel differently about their place in Dutch society, even if they didn't get married. So it's an interesting and complex kind of question, and I think it's one that feminists in particular take a different approach to sometimes, but it's complicated even for feminists. I've had people at IAFE conferences, like, after having a big rip-roaring debate about marriage in a session, say, yeah, we might get married anyway, or we need to get married because because of the tax status. If one of us dies in the house, the inheritance taxes would be very, very high. So there's all sorts of really interesting aspects to it, both personal and political.
That's wonderful. Now that we're talking about how these laws have evolved to become more inclusive and progressive, I wanted to get like a general opinion from you. I'm certain that you've talked about this in many podcasts and interviews and articles related to your work. How do you think the conversation around LGBTQ plus equality has progressed over time? How much do you think have we progressed in recognizing and addressing the crucial barriers that the community faces with a more thoughtful process? And has this been different in developing countries versus developed countries based on your work?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are both kind of the aspects of how we talk about these issues, and then what really is happening. If you look at laws in the United States and Western Europe in particular, in Latin America, there's been a lot of what I would call progress towards equality and inclusion. And that is both in the context of getting rid of laws that discriminate against LGBT people, related to criminalization of homosexuality or criminalization of certain aspects of gender nonconformity. There have been there's been, an expansion of laws that protect people against discrimination. And, there's now, I don't know, 30 some countries that recognize the right to marry, and many other countries give a right to a different kind of legal status for same-sex couples. So there's definitely been changes there. And I think, mostly, I think in those places, the kind of progress, we talk about it in the sense of it being, if not inevitable, just sort of part of a trajectory, which I think I think people in IFE are pretty sophisticated in understanding that narrative to be problematic. So, for example, in the United States, although we've had all those great changes, right now we're seeing unprecedented attacks, like hundreds of bills being introduced in states in the US that would really be very harmful to transgender young people in particular. So it's about getting medical care. It's about having access to the kinds of things that everybody has access to otherwise in schools, whether it's access to appropriate toilet facilities or access to, being able to be part of the same kinds of athletic events, that sort of thing. Those are all kind of currently part of this big trend towards inscribing inequality in the law for an important part of the LGBT community. So it's not to be taken for granted, for sure. And there's even, we've even had one Supreme Court justice suggest that because of the case that undermined the right to access to an abortion in the US, because of that law and the legal basis that it was decided on, he thought we could go back and reconsider whether or not same-sex couples should have the right to marry in the United States. And he's pushing for that, in fact. So I think, I think it looks good, in some ways, but not so good in others. And there's also, I think, an unfortunate aspect of, the difference in the discussion in developing countries, which are not as far, down that path towards decriminalizing homosexuality and making laws more equal. And some of that is because of what's happened in other places. The most visible and recent kinds of successes on marriage equality sometimes are taken as a starting point or are promoted as the so-called starting point, often by people who really don't want to see any progress on LGBT issues in developing countries, to say this is a Western thing, this is not part of our culture, where somebody's trying to impose this, when in fact, if you look at what's happening in those countries, in the civil society organizations, the public discussions that are happening in developing countries, they're not about that at all. They're about those most basic rights to exist, to get rid of laws that criminalize. We still have 65, 70 countries that criminalize homosexuality. Many others criminalize aspects of being transgender. So I think that the really important thing to know is that there are these kind of more local conversations that are happening with local actors who really should be the ones who are and really are the ones who are pushing the narrative. There's no big LGBT group in the sky that's like sort of beaming down the same messages from the United States and Western Europe into developing countries. That's just not really happening. If you're hearing those messages, it's mostly because the anti-LGBT people are raising those. So that's a few thoughts, that I think are, kind of relevant to your question. I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Your experience? Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely in India, it is assumed that it's something out of the ordinary, that we're doing something that's not entirely normal. And conversations on a personal level are yet to be addressed, yet to be confronted. parents, the intergenerational gap is so much that of ideologies that there's a lot of friction in getting to that point. But there has been an ownership of public spaces by communities. And I think that is one space where the developing countries are making some stride. You spoke about local actors driving the change, and I have a very interesting conversation I had very recently. So I attended the India conference at Harvard. It's held every year, and one of the panels there was on LGBTQ plus rights in India, where Revati Amma, she's a transgender social activist and writer from Bangalore. And she spoke about the importance of having unisex bathrooms in all public spaces, as well as eliminating language that uses first, second, and third gender to address individuals, while also subtly reinforcing the social order of these constructed genders. As someone from a developing country myself, I'm interested in knowing your perspective on like the necessary steps we need to take to initiate similar conversations at a personal level that will more or less never involve the economics of the labor market, as well as how do we reduce stigma surrounding discussions about sexual orientation or gender identities. This also stems from the fact that there are a lot of bargaining theories that study the labor division of skill within a household, which is primarily on binary genders. So now that we are talking about same-sex marriage and we're talking about legalization of marriage, how do you think that space is to be addressed?
Those are big questions. Yeah, I think that there are lots of really profound challenges that are being raised by conversations like that at the local level. And I think that's, that's the way to do it. You have to get any kind of change within a particular set of, cultural understandings around gender and sexuality. Starting with with where people are is essential, I think, and it's hard to universalize around this kind of question, I think, but raising the questions is a way to push people to think harder about why we have to have such rigid gender categories, I think. And how are they built into how we do things? How are they also, they may be having disproportionate impacts on people who identify in some way as transgender or non-binary, or of the third gender categories that you do hear a lot about in South Asia. But also, they may have implications in particular for cisgender women, as we've come to call them, cis being the people who are identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. And in some ways we think about in lots of contexts, having different toilet facilities is about safety and access for to schools in particular for girls, so that I would say would be like the most it may be a very particularly kind of challenging conversation to have, but I think using people's experiences that are happening in the places where the conversations are being held is what's really essential. I think that's, to me, that probably changes more hearts and minds than anything. We can do research on these topics and show the harms of them to people's health. We can show the harms to people's education level, the harms to them in the workplace. But those do matter, I think, in the conversation. And sometimes talking about them in those terms helps people see what's at stake, why those of us who identify as LGBTI care so much about these issues, because they're hurting us, they're killing us in many ways, literally. If you're thinking about violence and bad health, but also just the personal stories of people who are close to you, I think have also always been very powerful for people to understand, why it's so important for one of their children or for one of their siblings or one of their friends to be able to live as an openly LGBTI person. Those are the kinds of things that have been shown to be really important by psychologists, for example, in changing people's opinions about LGBTI folks. So I think it is about those conversations. I think you really kind of, hit the nail on the head. Those more provocative, far-reaching questions, may not be the first place to start for everybody, but there's certainly, questions that we can have really interesting and important conversations about.
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful thought. As researchers, I think we tend to bucket ourselves in academic research and papers and finding evidence of violence or discrimination over our history. But what we forget about is the voices that really matter in the space. So
Yeah.
thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, and actually I will say though, that I think economics sometimes has something to contribute in another way too, which is to take something that's seen as like purely cultural, purely religious, and to shift it onto a different territory to talk about it. And that sometimes is useful in taking some of the red hot sort of emotion out of the topic, so that we can get to understanding what this means for people in a different kind of way.
Yeah. So I want to circle back to your research in a space. I want to understand from a theoretical perspective how feminist economics and can I call it LGBTQ plus economics? Because okay, so yeah, I'm curious about how feminist economics and the LGBTQ plus economics intersect. I think it's important to shed light on some of the commonalities between these two disciplines, as well as highlight the points where it's necessary to make a distinction between the two.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Because there is now starting to be something called LGBTQ economics, and most of the people who are practicing that do not identify as feminist economists. Some of us do, but not all of us. And so it has in many cases, a very mainstream kind of flavor to it, a very neoclassical sort of flavor to it. And yet I would say there's definitely common ground. Empirically, the interest in understanding when and where inequality exists is something that I think is shared. And many of the tools that we use as feminist economists are tools that more mainstream people use too. So I think that's good because it means that we can all learn a lot from each other. But I do think there are some ways that there is a bit of a departure. When I'll review papers for conferences or journals that I think, have they ever heard of feminism at all? Thinking about gender in a much more subtle kind of way, where it's just sometimes just completely missing. And yet we know from other subjects that it matters a lot. I see Coral Del Rio, maybe that's Olga, also on this, and they've done some really interesting work on occupational segregation and thinking about it from a gendered perspective. And yet there's research by other economists who look at questions like tolerance towards LGBT people as determining which kinds of jobs people end up in, but completely ignoring the gendered context, completely ignoring the the fact that where we end up in occupations pretty much everywhere in the world is so heavily determined by our gender. So the mainstream side of things, they really need feminists to think about questions like that, like incorporating gender from maybe an intersectional perspective, thinking more broadly about intersectionality. So as our data has gotten better to study sexual orientation and to some extent gender identity, we can start to layer on differences of ethnicity and race. In the United States, those are very important factors that determine how people, what people's opportunities and economic outcomes look like. So intersectionality is something that really, I think, comes from feminist economics, much more so, definitely more so than neoclassical economics, thinking about the role of power and how politics emerge, and the role of the research that we do in some of these political questions is again something that they are just they're not equipped really to deal with very well. So I think there's definitely something there. Now, I think feminist economists have something to learn from LGBTQ economics as well, though. And this is going to sound really weird, but I'm going to make a case for it, which is a more nuanced understanding of gender. We tend to think of it really pretty much solely as the sex someone was assigned at birth, that kind of is layered on top of that our social and cultural expectations, the kinds of norms that we think of as being gender, as something separate from sex. And what we're learning from the people who are studying gender in the LGBTQ context is that you can actually unpack some different aspects of gender. So there's gender identity, how people think of themselves as male or female, or as men or women. But now we increasingly have these non-binary categories that are common in some cultures, as we were talking about South Asian culture before in the third gender, but but in others it's much more, much newer. We can think about gender expression as something that is potentially distinct from identity. As someone who gets CERT a lot, I can tell you that there are nuances, right? So that don't necessarily line up with gender identity. And so gender expression is something that, I hear sociologists, talking about it, but like trying to measure it and to capture what that means for how people do and the different kinds of, contexts that we study. We're not doing that. We're not doing that in feminist economics, but we should be. We could be thinking about, and that like gender perception is another kind of aspect of that. What people see. This is something that I think comes up in a lot of different contexts. Visibility of LGBTQ people is something that is managed, right? So it's not an either or kind of thing. Either somebody's queer or not, maybe at an individual level from someone well, but mostly, sociologists and psychologists think of identity disclosure as something that gets managed. And so we've thought some about that in LGBTQ economics, but not so much in the realm of feminist economics. But that might matter for a lot of other kinds of identities as well. A lot of disabilities are not visible, for example. So anyway, thinking again, so about perception, what do people see? We study individuals and what we know about them, but putting them into a social context so we know how other people are thinking about them, I think is something that would really change how we look at this. So we're starting to see some people doing this kind of work related to trans people. Travis Campbell, who's a student at UMass, was a student at UMass, and Mike Martell and Ian Byrne have a really interesting paper on this, where they show that a measure of gender expression that comes out of machine learning, using the data that we have and things that seem to be correlated with being identifying as male or female or expressing oneself in that way, that does seem to matter for people's wages, being gender conforming or not. but not so much for LGBTQ people, actually, but for heterosexual, cisgender people, it seems to make a big difference, much bigger difference. So overall, it does matter. And so, Mike is somebody who's been in IAFE, been active in IAFE a long time. So, and I see he's here. Hi, Mike. So anyway, so they have that great paper. So I think, those are things that we have to learn in the context of, that intersection between the LGBTQ side and feminist economists.
That's extremely interesting. I didn't know there was so much research in the recent times that's being done and using machine learning in this aspect. I'm just becoming privy to the language of machine learning, and I think it's quite interesting. So now I wanted to ask you, now that we have spoken about feminist economics, LGBTQ plus economics, what role do you think IAFE has played in you developing either this career or just pursuing your passions? What kind of support have you received from IAFE, and what did you have to give back?
Yeah, IAFE has really been central for me, for having space to present some of these ideas that I've worked on over the years, for having people to push back on them, to contribute to with suggestions, and just being a group of people where I know I have some shared values that I think I would like to see be more prevalent in our profession. Economics can be a really tough place, and having a space where it's not about competition for having the best publication outlets that you pursued, et cetera. Places where there was a much more open and kind of friendly atmosphere for people who identified as LGBT. That was just essential. I mean, it's been my intellectual home and kind of social home in economics, as long as it's existed. In fact, it was coming into existence just as I was getting out of grad school. So I feel very fortunate to have really had, IAFE all the way. And so I do think, for me, it's also been important to be involved and be active, to create that same kind of space for other people, and to learn from new people coming along in the profession about what are important issues, and seeing new research, new ideas come along. So yeah, for me, it's been absolutely essential. And I, am proud to have been elected president-elect right now of IAFE, and I'm just really excited about the work that's going on. It just feels like we're at this new stage that's, anything can happen. Lots of things are going to happen.
That's wonderful. I completely agree with, I've only been here for 2 years, but I completely agree the kind of intellectual home or social home that you find here, especially when we attended the conference last year. It was an absolute eye-opener. I did not expect to be so aligned in ideologies. Might not be the same in research interests, but ideologies were almost the same, which was quite encouraging for me to pursue this space as well. As a young scholar, I want to know I want to know what advice would you have for some other young scholars who are pursuing similar spaces where there is a lot of social limitation, as well as very limited encouragement for these kinds of topics of research.
Yeah, you have to build your own support structures, I think, in economics. They're not going to be there for you to just kind of walk into. But I think we do that at our own institutions, wherever we are. Hopefully from the beginning, in graduate school, and meeting people. I know for me, the folks that I went to graduate school with, we happen to, kind of be very aligned, and many of them have been very active in IAFE too. So that's been great to, continue to have that sort of support network. But yeah, to have a place, to find the place where you feel comfortable, presenting your work it's just so essential, because we have to learn how to talk about it. We have to learn how to show why it's important. And IAFE is a very friendly audience. And so I think that's really, really important. I think we keep trying to carve out space for ourselves in the broader mainstream of the profession too. So at the AEA, we now have a committee on the status of LGBTQ individuals in the economics profession, shortened mercifully to CSQIP. And we have activities that people can participate in. We've got a mentoring conference coming up in June. If there are advanced grad students on the call who are interested in that, you can write to me and I can get you connected to the information. It may also be on our CSQIP page at the AEA website. So there are some structures also in the more mainstream side to take advantage of. And I think we, it's good to have a foot in both camps. I was going to say, a foot in lots of different organizations, and that sounds kind of weird. You can have a hand in one and a foot in the other, but we will have a bigger impact on the economics profession if we are also engaged with the mainstream. So I think it's good for us to try to create that space there too.
Okay, so you've been so nicely talking for the last 40 minutes. I'm going to relieve you of that and ask you if you have any questions for me as a part of IAFE and the Young Scholar Committee.
Yeah, well, I do. And in particular, so I teach a lot of this stuff on LGBT issues, and I'm struck by my experience with my students and with some of the data that I've seen about how much things have changed for younger cohorts of people around how they see sexual orientation and gender identity. So my question for you, I'm curious about, both your cohort, your stage in the profession, and also coming from India, does what has emerged seem relevant and useful in the context of what things look like today for young people, what things look like today in India?
Okay, that is quite a long question.
Yeah.
So I think I did field research for the last 3 years in Bihar, which is a tier 2 city, tier 2 state. And then I moved to Odisha, which is another tier 2 state, very agriculturally heavy, but then moved back because of the pandemic. Now, some of the things that were highlighted in this experience was one, a lot of social programs that we are working on are with women. But at the same time, the agency by women is lacking. Even if you go and conduct surveys, it's very difficult to find a woman independent of her husband or independent of any household member. So that the fact that research methodologies are now incorporating these limitations and kind of working around it, tweaking their system to make sure that they do get an independent opinion. I think that has something that has evolved over time. Because through the emergence of, I guess, phone surveys, that has also become a little more nuanced. The LGBTQ plus space, unfortunately, has not evolved as much from the activism space to the economic space. In the India conference itself, we had a very interesting discussion, but more of it was on a sociological perspective. It was definitely lacking the economics of labor market or labor divisions or skill development. I think that's definitely still, the space still remains how it was. But the Time Use survey that was conducted in India in 2019 has finally incorporated transgender as the third gender. And so now we have male, female, and transgender. And it's a significant step that has been taken to make sure that we do have some data on the work distribution of transgenders. So there's been progress, but not so much. Now that I'm here, doing my master's and learning about these so many macroeconomic models and microeconomic models that have absolutely nothing to do with gender or feminism or the LGBTQ plus, I find it a little discouraging, I guess, in the sense that I'm still seeking professors more than there is already a space there. But as you said, that you have to build the support system yourself. It won't just exist on its own and be there. It's also been very interesting to see different nationalities and ethnicities have different opinions about what it means to be LGBTQ plus or just the women in their own country, and then bring that perspective into a developed country like the US, and also find commonalities as well as keep themselves distinct enough to make an impact, to be unique in this space as well. So there's a short versus long answer to your question.
Good. So what about, so the young scholars, have been very proactive in trying to, create these kinds of conversations. I'm wondering if there are other things that IAFI can do to create more space for, to be more open and welcoming to new people coming in, or things that would help people who are in positions like yours, where you may have a harder time connecting in some cases with the people who can give you the sort of intellectual experiences that you want to have. I mean, what else could we be doing?
That's a great question. We every month we have a young scholar committee, and this is something that's on priority in most of our meetings. I think some things that are already underway is the pre-conference event that we have in Cape Town. Now that we have received substantial funding, we are going to organize a feminist economics summer school, which will be for 2 days. So far, we've been focusing on connecting young scholars to senior scholars to get them FaceTime or just get some mentorship from them for their current research. But I think what we were lacking was some communication within the young scholars themselves. So now we're trying to build that space through this conference as well. We're going to bring in young scholars as well as senior scholars, but also have a focus on young scholars interacting amongst themselves to build a support system that is for them, instead of always constantly seeking mentorship from the senior scholars. I think another thing that's underway is that the Feminist Economics Journal is now looking to incorporate more young scholar papers. I think that's a very significant impact. To be seeing alongside young senior scholars publish papers. We are trying to make a mentorship or a guidance document that would work around that. The pre-conference committee is a composition of senior scholars and young scholars. So just, I think the efforts that are underway are already, evidence of how inclusive the senior scholars have been and how supportive they have been so far. I hope I'm not missing anything in case the Young Scholar Committee spoke about something and I haven't mentioned it yet. But yeah, I think it's been quite appreciated, the space that has been built and is being built at the moment.
Great.
Okay, so coming to the last 10 minutes, I'm going to go back to you to answer the questions. I'm opening up the floor for anyone to ask questions regarding Professor Badgett's research, but 2 questions that were posed to me earlier, and I would like for you to address them, is what role could social scientists, particularly economics, play in advocating LGBTQ plus individuals, apart from the research that they're currently doing?
Yeah, interesting word to use, advocating for. I think that often the research that we do can be very useful in the context of activist efforts. We still have to, use this, be sure that we use the same kinds of meet the same kind of quality standards of good, solid research that we do. But if we've got something that's useful, then the question is, how do you get it there? And I have thought a lot about this, and wrote a book called The Public Professor: How to Use Your Research to Change the World. Starting from, but pulling in some other people's experiences, but starting from my own experiences and doing this kind of engaged scholarship is another way to put it. And the three things that I've seen be really important for folks who are good at doing that are, first of all, you have to have a good idea about where your research fits into the debate. What are the big questions? What is it that you have to contribute to that debate? So you have to know the big picture of what's going on there, what the issues are, and that I think is something that you can develop in lots of different kinds of ways. The second thing is to have a really good network. So we probably, as academics, are not the people who are going to be at the decision-making table, unless you happen to be elected to your parliament or something, or you're on a corporate board, or other kinds of places where important decisions get made that affect LGBT people's lives. You need to find the people. You need to get to those folks. You need to get your research into their hands, and the network is how you do that. So I think we talk to each other in economics and in IAFE, but we need to go beyond that to have those kinds of connections. So getting to know the folks who you think might be interested in your work or who might be able to use it in some way is the first step in getting it out there into the hands of people who might use it. And then the last piece is learning to communicate to different kinds of audiences. We have our own jargon in economics and even in feminist economics, and that is good for communicating within that little sphere. But if we want to talk to people who are not academics, we have to be able to put it into terms that those folks will understand. Or if you want to write an op-ed piece for a newspaper, you have to put it in more journalistic kinds of terms. So learning to developing different genres, being able to cross styles, cross genres in writing and speaking, I think is also very important. And if you put all these things together, then you get lots of opportunities to do that. Whether you're invited to be on a podcast or a radio show, or to write something for a newspaper, to write something for a newsletter, to speak in front of an audience of legislators. Those are all different ways, different chances that we have to actually take that work and make it useful. So I think research has been enormously important for LGBTQ issues, because there are a lot of stereotypes and, frankly, outright lies that are told about LGBTQ people in different parts of the world in different contexts. And so research is the way to push back on that. So I think that's absolutely essential for us to be engaged in that way.
Yeah, that is interesting. Even I was quite happy to see that even in my school currently, we do this in statistics when we're studying our concepts. We talk about get your result, interpret the result, and then explain it to me like I'm an intelligent but not a well-versed statistician. So almost all our questions are surrounding that. How would you explain it to your grandma? How would you explain it to a public policy professional who's not a statistician? How would you write it in an article? So I guess that global push towards making the language a lot more accessible has been quite encouraging. Another question I have is, there have been recent developments in data gatherings that account for LGBTQ plus individuals in Census Bureau. How reliable do you think that data is, and what principles should be followed to improve these processes?
Yeah, the data question is essential, because for those of us who are more empirical economists, this is our lifeblood, and the expansion of data that's available is why there's so much more work on LGBTQ issues. So it is important to do a good job of that. And there are tensions, because I think LGBTQ people that I know have very subtle and nuanced kinds of terms, identity terms they might use for themselves, or some terms that they prefer over others. It's sometimes hard to fit all of that into a survey question. And here's the challenge in particular that sometimes we have to reckon with. It's not sometimes we have to reckon with, we always have to reckon with it, which is that the people we want to make sure, probably the most important people to understand are the people who are not LGBTQ, because as a small population, if some people get confused and mark a box that makes it look like they're LGBTQ, but it was a mistake in some way, then all of our LGBTQ data kind of gets contaminated. So we want to get it right. So it means that you have to do some methodological research, and lots has been done in some countries, I know, to understand the best ways to answer, to create these questions, these survey instruments. And what I've learned is, some of the ways that gets done. Statistical agencies will do cognitive interviewing, for example, giving people examples and about questions, and then asking them to talk through what they were thinking about when they answered it. So that has affected how we do questions in the United States. So, for example, one of the big questions, one of the most common questions is on sexual orientation is something like this: which of the following best describes how you think about yourself? And then the answers would be heterosexual, lesbian or gay, bisexual. Sometimes maybe they might put on something else, or maybe another category. And it turns out that actually, when they did the study of that question, that a lot of people that we might think of as heterosexual don't use that term for themselves. So it wasn't something that was easily recognized. So they changed that response category in a lot of US surveys to heterosexual or straight, because people were much more likely to recognize one of those two terms. Sometimes there are questions that say, heterosexual or straight, that is not gay or lesbian. So sometimes there have to be adjustments made that might seem odd to us, who are so used to thinking about, how we think, what our identities are and why, to make sure that everybody can see where they really fit in. So that's a challenge. So there's been lots of methodological research to test out questions that are used. On gender identity, the same kind of thing is happening. There's now a preference for kind of a two-step process. One step asks, what was the sex that you were assigned at birth? And even that construction, I think is something that not everybody's that familiar with. So they might ask it a somewhat different way. But and then how do you identify now? And a second question, you're asked about your current gender identity to see if they're the same, or if that gender identity is like transgender or non-binary or something like that. So there's been lots of testing of those questions. There's a great National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine report on that for looking at the US-based questions. And I think there's probably some useful aspects of that experience that we can use in other countries' context to look at that. So I know the data question is very big and for developing countries, and like for the multilateral development banks that are trying to help work with developing countries and are interested in being more inclusive of LGBT people, and there is a lot of that interest. This question about data is a new one that they're grappling with, and how to ask those questions. So so it is something that we need more data, but we want to do it well. So I think that's important to know about.
Great. I think there's no better way of ending a discussion on economics without talking about data. So I'm gonna. Do you have any final reflections? Any current work that you're working on that would be interesting to follow through, and any other plugins that you'd like to make here?
Yeah. Well, I'll just say that one of the things that I'm doing now is something that doesn't sound a lot like typical economic research. I'm starting case studies that will be qualitative in nature to interview people involved in efforts to economically empower LGBTI people. Programs that are designed to increase skills, think about entrepreneurship, think about credit, social enterprises, co-ops, all those kinds of possibilities that might enhance the livelihoods that people have. So what I'm trying to do is to make the case that this is a really useful area for development economists to start thinking about, because it's mostly been limited to labor economists, to some health economists, and mostly in the United States, or even economists who are not in the US are using US data because it's easily available. So I think the questions of data are really important for increasing the amount of attention that we're spending on other countries, including developing countries. So I hope that that there'll be more people who are interested in taking up these topics. It's a great research agenda to build on.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee Badgett. Before we wrap up, I just want to take a moment to thank everyone who joined us today in person, virtually, and those who will watch the session later on YouTube. I truly hope that you all enjoyed the session as much as I did. As I reflect on today's conversations, I realize these discussions are almost always overlooked in mainstream economics. And as I pursue my own master's, I feel that it's important to make these sessions a regular part of our lives than just special events. It has to form the mainstream economics as well to talk about inclusion of the marginalized communities so far. I really want to express my sincere gratitude to you for your presence today, and for your profound work in this space. Your contributions in this field are truly inspiring, and I can't wait to finish reading your book and then share my insights with the world. Last and not the least, I would like to thank the Online Events Committee and Young Scholar Committee for giving me this incredible opportunity and for showering me with all the confidence and support throughout the preparation of this session. I am truly grateful. Please mark your calendars for our next session in March, and thank you all for being here today for today's conversation. Have a great day. Thank you.
You.